Dear friends, one of the most important things that has come out from my public health review over the past 2 years is that there is complete chaos and ad hoc decision making in public health in relation to quarantine and mass testing and so on. These are the NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions. So, what I'm going to do today in this short talk is to summarize what I've written in my Times of India blog. I've sent it to these guys for publication. It'll probably come out in the next few days. But the main arguments is what I want to summarize here so that you understand why we need some much higher level of regulation of public health. So, what's been happening in public health so far is that uh, every single doctor, the health specialist or whatever, Fauci or Brett Sutton, um, everybody is out there creating their own policies. Even Anders Tegnell, or even the great Barrington Declaration doctors. There's no process for scientific validation of any of the findings or recommendations in public health, particularly in relation to NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions. So, in my piece, I talk about how there is a very stringent regulatory process for drugs and vaccines, but there's absolutely nothing for these other interventions, not for NPIs. On the other hand, the harms caused by these other interventions, the NPIs, vastly exceed the harms caused by the drugs. As far as I can make out, the very few drugs that can beat the lockdowns, and I think there's absolutely no drug in human history that has come even remotely close to the harms caused by the COVID lockdowns. So, how did these people implement lockdowns? What gave them the confidence to do it? And all that, backing. What's backing the whole thing? There is nothing, and that's the whole problem. They do not have a scientific methodology. Instead, what they do is they all have their individual opinions based on some paper here or some book there. They formed a view, impressionistic view, where there is nothing like robust scientific information to back it up. This is what I've started my blog post with, saying that in the absence of proper scientific methodology, we have a situation where vast harms are being caused by these NPIs, and the other is that there is absolutely arbitrary decision making going on here, which I already mentioned. And I believe there's a lot of political influence in this decision making as well. So the other part is the variability. In my recent research on school closures, I found a good example where when these school closures were started, and it was actually started in the 1880s. Before that, there were no school closures, at least in England, for the sake of preventing disease. What these closures did, what these one of the doctors did was to ask the medical officers about what are the conditions by which they impose these closures. What would they do? What do they really think about? And so some doctors said, "Oh, we will close the school if there is 2 to 5% of the students have measles." Others said, a small percentage said, we need 50% of the students to have measles before we close the school. But more than half the doctors said, or roughly half the doctors said that they've got no method and no particular percentage, and they therefore are, uh, you know, just played by the ear. They just form a view based on whatever comes to their mind. This is exactly the problem, that there is no scientific method, no proof of any of these NPIs. Therefore, there's a lot of variability and what I call chaos in the discipline. How do we? And one of the indications of that chaos is that they refuse to answer questions. It's not just Brett Sutton who blocked me on Twitter for asking him, why should I wear mask outdoors? It's also the Great Barrington Declaration, the good doctors who really don't want to reply to me when I ask them what's the proof for their, policy, which I believe is definitely going to cause more harm than good. And I've written a lot about that. But the point is that they just have an opinion. There is no proof behind it, not the slightest backing of behind this opinion that they form. And so at the end of it, it's political. So if there's Anthony Fauci standing there with Donald Trump and giving his, talk to the US population or the world population, and that's one example of that. The other is, of course, other health officers. But even, we think of the good officers, good, doctors as well. How do they actually get their policies across? They basically have to do politics and canvassing, and they're doing, all sorts of political activity in order to get to a point where others are going to listen to them. That's not the way science should work. Science should work in a manner that everybody together can come to a same, a debating position or a hall or whatever, and both sides give their opinion, and with the facts, then all sides agree that this is the truth. That's called science. What we have is politics. So, how do we fix this problem of bringing science into NPIs, such as quarantine? Some people keep on, citing the Cochrane collaboration as a great, a wonderful scientific body. I personally don't find it to be very scientific at all. I find it does random controlled trials and a few other things, but it doesn't have the ability to understand the total impact of an NPI, for example, masks, on the whole society. Without a proper cost benefit analysis, without the full fledged analysis of what's happening across society, it simply is not an appropriate body to do these things. And then the question is, okay, wouldn't the Trump administration that's come into place now with all the good people, wouldn't it automatically fix things? And I think the answer is no, because the systems, unless systems change, the underlying institutions or the rules change, the same thing will happen again. Of course, we may not get the lockdowns. Supposing COVID were to happen again, we won't get the lockdowns. And we may not get a few other bad things like vaccine mandates, but we're going to get almost everything else in the future, like school closures. Who knows? We might get focus protection or whatever. So there's no real change. And as soon as this administration goes, the lockdowns will come back. So what we need is a process to prove what is good and what is bad in this particular case. And so what I've come to the solution is that just like with drugs, we need somebody to test it and to prove it. In the case of drugs, we have a very rigorous process by which the effectiveness of the drug is tested, the side effects are tested, and then finally, if it's found to be, effective and doesn't have many side effects, then it is approved for use. And a similar process we need for these NPIs, where the FDA becomes the regulator for all the NPIs. And instead of the private business organization, we will have the CDC. At the moment, the CDC is all in all, it decides and it keeps changing its mind. And I've given some examples on how it changed its mind on school closures, for example, during swine flu. Uh, the fact that there is a body that can continuously change its mind without needing to provide any proof, that's the problem. What we need is a regulation of this process, and this means that the CDC will not be able to approve or implement any of these policies unless there is a prior agreement by the FDA. So what would happen is anybody, including me or an academic, they could propose to the CDC saying that this is a good thing or a bad thing. Then the CDC will have to undertake a detailed scientific analysis uh, based on the information provided, but also consulting with the rest of the world, the public, the experts, and then it'll have its own cost benefit analysis, followed by a decision that the CDC will make whether this is worth pursuing. It is not going to be a decision to implement the NPI. That is not within its power anymore. It should not be within its power. That particular then decision to support a particular NPI has to be taken to the FDA. So the FDA will get its tens of thousands of pages of proofs. FDA will then consult widely. FDA will analyze based on the fact that this is scientific or not scientific, whether this is, they're using mathematical models which are simply not science, or they're using ethics or some other precautionary principle or some other things. Instead of that, FDA will look for the actual science, the cost benefit analysis, whether all the harms are being counted properly, whether the benefits are not being exaggerated, etc., etc. There's no cherry picking going on, etc. So once that is done, the FDA will then approve that NPI, and that's how the CDC will then be able to implement. Now, I know that this is a big leap from the current system, but I've thought about this over the last 2 years now. I've come to a view at this point in time. If I find a better solution or somebody else suggests a better solution, I'm happy to go with that. But at the moment, this seems to be the proper way where the CDC becomes a proponent. Academics do not have a right to publish things which are not approved by the FDA. They need to go through the process. Neil Ferguson can't go to the press and say, "Hey, this pandemic is going to kill so many people." He has to go to the proper process. There must be a prior approval of lockdowns or whatever he wants to implement. And in that manner, we will control all this panic responses, etc., that are coming out from the media and the academia. Therefore, that's my proposal. However, I'm I'm not sure that this is going to work easily because the CDC would not like to let go its powers. The second point is the FDA might not actually follow a scientific process, which is a huge issue. But if all these things are done properly, then the Trump administration today has a unique, it's in a unique position to actually implement fundamental institutional reform in the case of NPIs. And therefore, all of us will have potentially, at the end of the day, thousands of pages of proof showing why lockdowns are good or why they're bad. And I think that's the way we will finally get some science into public health. Hopefully, you agree with me. If you don't, please let me know. Thank you.